Hello, welcome. I'm Beth Cougler Blom, and this is Facilitating on Purpose. In this episode, I'm really pleased to present a conversation that I have with Julie Dirksen. Some of you might know Julie's name because she is the author of now not just one, but two books in the field of learning design. Her first book was called Design for How People Learn, and her second one, which is the focus of this conversation, is called Talk to the Elephant: Design Learning for Behavior Change. We don't often have episodes that are solely devoted to learning design on Facilitating on Purpose because we so often default to talking about facilitation, what we're doing in the in-person or the virtual rooms with our learners. But I'm a learning designer and a facilitator, and you might be as well. If you are facilitating, you are often the one who is also designing. And this episode will give you a chance to geek out on that foundational design side of our work. Even if you don't call yourself a learning designer or an instructional designer or user experience designer, all the other terms that we have in the design area, you are going to benefit from this because Julie makes our focus on designing for behavior change in this conversation really easy by telling lots of stories to back up the concepts that she's talking about. So while, yes, she and I really nerd out on having a design-related conversation here, I think and hope it'll still be very accessible for all of you who don't necessarily spend as much time as we might thinking about the design side of things. But hey, the more you are intentional in your design stage, the easier it is if you are facilitating an experience when you get into the room with participants. So this is about intention around design, and it's about behavior change. I hope you enjoy the show. Julie, welcome. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am curious about one thing, first of all, and it has to do with your role, but it's more how you explain what you do. So when you go to some sort of party or gathering and you are surrounded by people who don't do learning design work, they have no idea what instructional design or learning design even is, how do you explain your role and what you do?
I mean, I usually will say that I'm an instructional designer, but with zero expectation that anybody will know what that means. I mean, I think maybe 2 or 3 times over the years, somebody's been like, oh, okay. And I'm like, wow, okay. All right. You actually understand that. But then I'll usually explain that I work with training and that it's usually about creating workplace training for different kinds of things. And that, that my background's in things like educational psychology and that sort of thing. And, or educational technology. So I'm trying always to find like the words that will resonate with people and that they can recognize and stuff like that. Because yes, explaining what we do is often really difficult for people. Nobody understands it out of the gate if they haven't heard of it before. So
Yeah, I can relate. I think I boiled it down to I create courses with organizations or something like that, like the bare
yeah.
bones.
hmm
Yeah, no, that's great. So you've been doing this your whole career or almost your whole career working in the learning field?
Yeah, I pretty much when I was an undergrad, I was an English major, which of course immediately led to so many different job prospects, except it didn't. And the first kind of thing that I actually did was a certificate in teaching English as a foreign language, and I did that for a little bit. But I was also working for a financial company at the time, doing just data entry stuff after while I was in college as a part-time job. I always sort of describe people's path, like lots of people's origin story is something along the lines of, hey, you're a good customer service rep. We're going to let you train the other customer service reps. And that was pretty much my version. Hey, you're good at this data entry thing. Do you want to be a trainer for the other data entry people? And I was like, sure. And that was a mixed thing between like classroom facilitation and creating the materials. And we didn't really know what we were doing. I look
Nobody
back at it
does
now and I'm
when
like,
we start.
right, exactly. Exactly. I look back at it now and I'm like, oh, yeah, I think that we more or less created okay stuff, but boy, it was sure rough and ready. And I mean, I think our whole tool kit at the time was, a Microsoft Office subscription. So this is now 30 3 years ago, I think. So, e-learning wasn't even a thing yet. We were still talking about computer-based training, and the web was still kind of a glimmer in people's eyes and stuff, because I'm that old. But yeah, which gave me this interest in instructional design. I also got really interested in, I was working with their call center group, and the biggest challenge we had was teaching people how to use this sort of very creaky, antiquated computer system. And so I also wound up managing a project to look at putting a front end system over the existing, computer systems so that it would work better for the customer service people. And so that gave me a perspective really early on of like approaching it from two different ways. There's the learning pathway, which is we teach people to use the tools better. But then there's also, sometimes it makes more sense to fix the tools than it does to try to fix the people. And that led me towards an interest in things like user experience design and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I don't know all of your background or, even probably half of it, but I do know that you worked with Michael Allen, who probably was pivotal in your past because he's a big guru in the field of e-learning design.
Yeah, absolutely. I started working with them right after I finished my master's. I did my master's in instructional systems technology at Indiana University, which was kind of one of the biggest ID programs at the time in the US. And I picked it partially because it also had a lot of coursework in what we now call user experience, although at the time we were still calling it like human computer interaction and things like that. And so then after graduate school, I went to go work for Michael Allen's company, and I was there for 8 years. And yeah, it was absolutely foundational, and just some of the different things that he was really influential in terms of thinking about learning design and what really good kind of instructional interactivity looked like, and also the methods that they had around doing rapid prototyping for e-learning in that company. I remember I'd done some e-learning development and stuff, and you play around with authorware at the time. It wasn't, then Flash, and now Storyline is, the current software I think that mostly is used for this stuff. But I remember it was the first, I don't know, 2 weeks that I was with the company, something like that. And I'm in a meeting, and we're there, I was just there to listen in and kind of learn. But the designer and the developer were kind of like talking about, oh, we could prototype it like this. And they were working with the client. And they're like, okay, we'll call you back at 3. And this is like, I don't know, 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, wait, what now? And they're like, yeah, we'll have the prototype then. And I was just like, oh, 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 because I was so used to like it taking days or weeks to kind of formulate, a beta version of something. And they would do this thing where they would prototype something in like 2 hours, and then get client reactions to it really quickly. And I just remember being flabbergasted by it. And it's actually a pretty amazing thing to like try stuff out and start getting reactions to it really quickly, especially with interactive material or something like that, where how it works is such an important component of it, not just how it looks or what it says. And so, yeah, so I learned to do that too, learned to do rapid prototyping and love it.
And it's so people focused too, right? Like that
Yeah.
must have been a great just delve into an introduction to it's the people at the heart of the process and what do they
Hmm.
think? And let's not go too far designing the thing before we get feedback on it. Yeah, that must have
Yeah.
been a great introduction.
And a really like strong focus on what is it that they actually need to be able to do. Like, okay, they're going to process these applications and they're going to evaluate them against a set of criteria. How do we create a practice activity that's as close to that as we possibly can manage, as opposed to let's tell you about, the applications for 37 slides and then finally give you some multiple choice questions. So yeah, no, it was amazing. And of course, Michael went on. This was before he had really like kind of formulated the SAM. I mean, we were doing it. He just hadn't named it SAM yet, but like things like leaving ADDIE for SAM and, the rapid prototyping methodology. So he wrote some books after that and things like that. And I think it's been influential for people. I love to do prototyping demos as part of like a workshop or something to sort of prove to people like, hey, in 10 or 15 minutes, we can actually have something that's a little bit functional enough to maybe test with somebody or at least get some feedback on. So
Nice. Oh, I love that. Your newest book is about behavior change. Was it always part of your practice? I mean, do you remember the point where you kind of thought, "Oh, it's about behavior. It's not about knowledge only."
I think there was always the focus on like behavioral application of things, but the place where the sort of origin story for that book really came, it was kind of in the mid 2000s, and I was attached to a project that we were working on at Allen about AIDS and HIV prevention strategies. And they were specifically looking at taking what had been quite a successful, it was through we were partnering with a few different groups, but it was mainly driven through the University of Minnesota School of Epidemiology. And they had a live classroom intervention that had worked really well for them and involved a lot of interpersonal interaction and small group kinds of stuff and these things. But they wanted to look at an online version because this one was obviously limited by people being able to like physically get to the place and have a weekend to take it and things like that. And they wanted to look at online resources for this same audience. And I was realizing like by about, I can't remember exactly what year this was, but around like say 2005. And by about 2005, most people had gotten the message around things like condom usage to prevent the spread of AIDS and HIV. Just telling people, hey, this is really important, didn't seem to be people knew, but sometimes the behavior still wasn't happening as consistently as we would like. And there were still, new cases and things like that. And so I was kind of like, all right, when I look through my like toolbox as an instructional designer, I have things for helping people understand stuff, helping people remember things, building skills at stuff. And none of those seemed to be the right answer in a circumstance where people knew what to do. Theoretically, they knew how to do it, although there were some subtleties there. Like, so for example, one of the things that they really talked about is how do you have that conversation where you negotiate safe sex practices with a partner? And do people need to build that as a skill and build their comfort with that and that kind of thing? But I was really kind of looking like at my toolkit and going, there's something missing here. Like when people genuinely know what to do and they're still not doing it, what's the and it's not, it turns out it's not a thing, it's many things. But that really was kind of the origin story on the new book around the Talk to the Elephant Design Learning for Behavior Change is telling people louder and more emphatically to do certain behaviors seems to not be the like special sauce in terms of getting those behaviors to actually happen. And so what else do we have? And it gets complicated really quickly because one of the issues is making sure that we're solving the right problem. Is the problem a lack of knowledge? Well, sometimes, but lots of times no. Is the problem like fear, anxiety, or discomfort with the behavior, right? So like negotiating sex practices with a partner can be really uncomfortable, so okay, what do we need to do around that? Or is it that the incentives are misaligned? We tell people we really want them to be customer focused when they're, talking to customers as part of a call center or something like that. But then the incentives are mostly about like reducing your talk time. Well, those things don't
Yeah.
always match up.
I worked in a call center once, and I think the incentive was around how much I upsold laundry detergent at the end of the service call, right? Like
Right.
it was a service center. Yeah, there was nothing about customer service that was incentivizing there.
Right. Yeah. No, my favorite example of that one, and I think I talk about it in the book, is I was doing some stuff for it was an insurance company that did multinational policies, which gets really complicated because you have to deal with the legal guidelines around insurance in a bunch of different countries and things. At one point, we're kind of sort of picking all this stuff apart and trying to understand what the flow of the training materials will be. And at one point, they said, well, here's the thing though, is when the data entry people are entering these applications, they're just not as careful about the accuracy thing as they should be. Like, can we put something in the training that says, that tells them that accuracy is super important? And I'm like, sure. Yeah. Remind me how they get paid again. And they're like, oh, the number of applications they do per hour.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, huh, do you
Interesting.
see the issue there? Right.
Yeah, like this truth teller that kind of just sheds light on a situation.
Yeah.
And do they go, oh, we've never looked at it that way before?
Yeah, they totally did. They're like, huh, no, yeah. I don't know, because I was like, do they get feedback on how accurate they are? And they're like, huh, no, I don't think they do. I'm like, all right, so here we are. We can put whatever you want in the training. I'm happy to do it. But, if we look at the actual root cause of this problem, you've got to disconnect there, right? You're saying accuracy is important, but you're paying them to go as fast as possible. And those two things how
Yeah.
do we get better alignment around that? So
Yeah, for sure. I think let's definitely come back to training is not always the answer because you're kind of
yeah,
going into that direction.
yeah.
But maybe I'll back you up a little bit and say, you wrote your first book, Designed for How People Learn, a few years ago, and it's been super successful. And you introduced the metaphor of the rider and the elephant in that book. I know because I have it. So I want you to explain the metaphor, if you will, so
Sure.
that people are kind of situated with that. But also, what was it about the second book that you had to write it? How and why did you need to go further? And was it based on feedback from the first book or, kind of what led to the second one?
Yeah. So the first book I was looking at trying to match up, because one of the things that happened to me in grad school is that they say, okay, you do this analysis and you understand your learners, and then you design an intervention. But there was kind of like no connective tissue between the analysis box and the design box. It was just like, and you will magically design this thing. And I was trying to pick apart, like, where can I have some foundation to stand on when I'm choosing an instructional strategy, right? Like it could be anything from like, is this better in person? Is this an e-learning? Is this a thing? But then also what's a useful activity? What's a useful experience? What's useful support materials? So I was trying to figure that out. So in the first book, Designed for How People Learn, which is very much intended for that, hey, you're a good customer service rep, you're going to train the other customer service rep, like that audience. We didn't seem to have a good like first book to hand people to help them with. Telling aid training is a good one, but we didn't have a good kind of purely instructional design book around how do you help people teach, your topic, how do you teach it? And I broke it down into a few different kind of types of gaps, the gap between where the learner is now and where you want them to be. And one of it is it knowledge? Like if I just give them the knowledge, will they be able to do the thing? In my own practice, I don't think I talk about it as much in the book, but in my own practice, I talk about procedures where we have really well-defined performance, and I'm just trying to get you to do it with speed or accuracy. Skills or anything where, again, it may take practice, but it also usually requires some judgment or some decision making. Motivation gaps are very much the, hey, they know what to do, but they still aren't doing it. I also have things like habit gaps because you can know you should floss your teeth, you can know how to floss your teeth, you can even have the motivation to floss your teeth, but if you don't have the habit, it's probably not happening on a regular basis. And then I talk about like environmental gaps, which is essentially what I was describing before, where it's maybe easier to fix the environment of the system than it is to fix the person. And of those, there were two chapter, and I had a chapter on each one and stuff. But of those, there were two chapters that just felt like I was kind of scratching the surface. And one of them was the motivation chapter. I'll talk about the rider and the elephant in a moment. And the other one is the skills chapter, which that is probably going to be book number 3. I'm putting together the proposal for it this summer, and we'll hopefully be writing it maybe over the winter, over the winter period or something like that. But the motivation piece, like I said, it's this, they know what to do, and yet there was just so much more to talk about. But the rider elephant metaphor comes from a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. And he was talking about this tension between, what we know and what we kind of feel is one way to think about it. And most of these decision making models, so like Daniel Kahneman, when he talks about thinking fast and slow, has the fast thinking system and the slow thinking system. System 1 and 2 is usually what he calls it. And that's similar, if not quite identical, but close enough to the rider and the elephant. I like the rider and the elephant because I think people get it. I mean, if you think about like brain regions, you have a lot of your brain that's concerned with things like moving your body around in the physical space and perceiving, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching things and perceiving the world and translating it. And you also have like hearing and seeing and fine motor control and gross motor control and emotional reactions. And all of that is kind of what Haidt refers to as the elephant. And then the rider is sort of logic, reason, executive function, the ability to project out into the future and consider consequences. There's areas of your brain that sort of activate, like your prefrontal cortex, when you're, exerting executive control or, things like that. And so we've got this divide in our decision making between what we intellectually know is a good idea and what feels like a good idea in the moment. And so the example I always use is your alarm goes off in the morning And it happened yesterday because I had a 6 a.m. meeting because of time zones, right? Because we had a bunch of people in Europe and somebody in Australia and whatever. And so I was the 6 a.m. person on this call. And so I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and it goes off. And I'm like, I should get up. I should get up. I should totally get up. An hour will be enough time for me to be like fully awake when I have to get on this meeting, and I'll be able to get coffee, and I'll, be able to like do my little morning routine and still, and still be present for this meeting. And I should totally get up, and I should totally get up and absolutely hit the snooze button for another 15 minutes. Right. And that's my rider knows intellectually that getting up is a great idea and is probably the most functional behavior in this circumstance. But my elephant is like, nice, warm, comfortable.
It's like, darn, it's early.
Right.
Yeah, no.
So that's both entities play into decision making, and a lot of those visceral feelings. I was working on a curriculum, and I use this example quite a lot in the book around hand washing for healthcare. And I remember talking to a doctor when I was working on one of these curriculums, and she's like, I know this stuff. I know this stuff so well. And even I, at the end of like a long shift when I'm like 3 hours overtime and, just getting tired, I can get a little bit more careless about this stuff than I should. How is that a thing? And I'm like, well, your elephant gets tired.
And
And
it's sort of lazy, or yeah, just
yeah,
competing demands or whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But what's the problem? And I'll say the problem, is that people want to talk to the writer and think the writer is the only one that's listening, and our clients come to us and ask us to design learning only for the writer, and what's the problem with doing that?
Yeah. Well, we have this belief that a rider can override our elephant if it needs to. And the truth is, it probably can. It just takes a lot of effort to do it. And if you need this behavior to be consistent, for hours and hours, or days and days, or weeks and weeks, or whatever it is, if your rider is battling your elephant, you're probably going to have, some issues with that, right? I absolutely know that I should wear sunscreen every day. We've got a family history of not super serious stuff, but, like the basal cell skin cancers and things like that, which are, not the scary kind, but they're still not great. And so I 100% know what the right behavior is, which is to be totally on top of my sunscreen basically all of the time. And that intellectual knowledge only goes so far. At a certain point, I have to still find ways to make it an easier behavior to do, to just always have a lot around, or have the kind of sunscreen I can put on my face that doesn't make my eyes sting, or, figure out a whole kind of range of strategies. And even then, behavior's still a little wobbly sometimes. So when we double down on intellectual, I mean, almost everything that's a behavior change problem has a issue where what we intellectually know doesn't match up with what we're physically experiencing. So I know that like I should, record my expense receipt, tax stuff, get it updated in the system, kind of, and stay on top of that all the time. And then my life will be much easier down the road. But the truth is, nothing bad's going to happen for, let's see, we're in July now. So like for 5 more months, if I am behind, if I don't stay on top of my expense receipts. And so that's out in the future. And our rider understands, hey, there's future consequences. But our elephant's like, you know what? I think if you like watch the YouTube video instead of dealing with your receipts, that nothing bad will happen. And it's right. It's right about that,
For now.
Or if you like go get coffee or a snack and you leave those receipts there for a while longer, it's true. Nothing bad's going to happen for a really long time. And then it's going to be, a massive pain, but it'll be fixable. It'll be recoverable. So that knowledge of what's going to happen in the future does not weigh very heavily with the elephant. And so we're always dealing with that. We're always kind of dealing with, I think the single most common element in all behavior change issues is kind of delayed or absent feedback. So, what's the bad thing that's going to happen if I don't wash my hands as a healthcare professional? Well, somebody could get sick, but the likelihood that I will know that me not washing my hands at like 3 o'clock on Thursday caused a particular infection is almost impossible. So, whenever we have that disconnect, we have behavioral challenges, and there's a whole slew of strategies that we can bring to play. but we need to be using them deliberately, and we need to be trying to address, the actual problem and not just berating people.
I know, and it's kind of struggly for me in a way to chat with you because there's so much in your book too that people just have to get it and read it and work through it and have it in front of them. I think when, the next learning design project comes our way and pull it out, right? Because it is really, really meaty. I'm actually listening to it as an audiobook, and I also own the physical book, and I think I need both, right? Because because
Right.
it's talk about cognitive overload in some ways. Not that you've written it that way, because you've got tons of examples and stories, and you've done all of the right things. Like, I can see what you're doing to help us learn the things in the book, but I also have to pull it out. I think the next time I have that problem in front of me that I'm going to try to do a little bit better on in terms of behavior change. Not that I don't think about it now, but we have to keep doing better,
Yeah.
right? And having those conversations with our clients, because I work for myself and a lot of us do, but I don't know, whoever it is that's coming to us saying, here's the problem, how do you, like, what are the first things that you say to people to start off and say, is this a knowledge problem? Is this a behavior problem? Like, it's often not a behavior problem that is coming our way. So how do you start? Like, what do you recommend for people to dig it? It's like a little exploration that we have to do to try to find the real issues, right? To solve as learning designers.
Yeah, there's a tweet that I screen capped and put in one of my presentations where I don't think he was a learning designer. I think he was a designer, but maybe like UX or something. But he was saying, my job isn't to implement your solution. My job is to understand what problem you're trying to, like, to uncover what problem it is you're trying to implement, to answer with the solution, and understand kind of how I can help you with that. And that happens a lot. Like, I actually have some slides in some of my workshops where I'm like, is this a problem or is this a solution? And if somebody's coming to you with a solution, that's fine. They may have done all of the thinking necessary to establish that this solution that they're trying to hand you, we need a training course, we need a safety e-learning on how to, like, prevent safety issues or something like that. They're showing up and they're wanting an e-learning program on this, and you have to kind of have this conversation with them about, okay, well, what problem are you trying to solve with this, and why do we think that an e-learning course is going to be a solution that makes sense? And it may be, and I mean, most of the time when people show up and they're like, we want an e-learning course on this, most of the time we will get to that, like, we will do that, but we want to have a conversation around what's the gap between where people are now and where they would need to be in order to be safer on the job. And is it that they don't really know how to put on the personal protective equipment? Is it that they know how to put on the personal protective equipment, but it's a hassle, and so they're shortcutting? Is it that they put on the personal protective equipment and it's supposed to keep them safe, but the glasses fog up and then they can't see, and then that's actually dangerous for them? And so their decision to not wear these consistently actually has a logical issue with it that we're definitely not going to fix with training. So where's the disconnect? Where's the issue? And I have a whole list of things that I usually go through that are common things that show up in training requests, because every time, like, I'm always interested in the fact that every time a corporation or an organization or an entity has a really massive screw up, they, like, something goes horribly wrong. Maybe they do something just kind of like, oh, look, an appalling example of bias, or things that didn't work the way that they were supposed to, procedures that led to, really unfortunate outcomes, whatever. There's always, 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 part of the apology is, we're going to do training. And it's sort of like, what's your level of confidence that the training that you're going to do is actually going to fix this
Yeah.
problem?
Again, it's like, could be a match. It could be a mismatch, as you said before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Misalignment. Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, training is frequently part of it, but it's usually not all of it, especially in these complex problems. And it's interesting to hear your reaction to the book, because I tried so hard to make this not overwhelming. I really, really did.
It's no, it's exciting though, because it is meaty. It's not just, I mean, you needed to write a whole other book basically about the issue and all of the things that are within it, right? I get that
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah.
And it is big, and it's like the most important work I think we learning designers have to do in a way with the people that come to us asking us to do, to create an e-learning course or whatever kind of learning experience it is, because they usually, in my experience, they don't often come with the crux of the problem that's actually happening. Actually, I use Cathy Moore's will training help
Yeah.
flowchart diagram a fair bit, right? And clients seem to like that, and it's an easy one pager. She's got a one pager to say like what's going on, right? Why do we think that training needs to? Yeah. So I don't want to promote her. I'm talking to you, Julie, but
Oh, no. I mean, I
there's
love
all
Cathy's
sorts of
stuff.
resources, right? We can draw on like that. Yeah. Like, is
Yeah.
it a training related problem? And maybe there's something in there, as you've
Yeah.
said, but there's other things often as well.
Yeah, no, no, no. I'm a fan of Cathy's stuff too, absolutely. So I'm happy for that to be promoted.
Yeah. But you talk about like, yeah, so not everything is necessarily a problem that we learning designers can solve in the role that we have. I liked that you talked about, what was it, the individual level, organization level, like a
Mhm.
system level. I'm probably kind of messing up the words a
No,
little
no,
bit, but
it's pretty
but
good.
often people come and say, "Oh, it's an individual problem," but it's actually not an individual issue or challenge, right? It's something bigger, systemic or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Like one of the examples I use is based on some stuff that happened at Salesforce.com. They were trying to address salary disparities based on things like gender or, ethnicity or things like that. One of the things that became really clear is that these problems were hard to see because there's always a reason, right? It wasn't that managers were like, I want to pay women less or I want to pay people less based on, race or ethnicity. Like, I don't think anybody was being individually like evil in this scenario. But what they found was, even though you have reasons for things, as long as there's judgment involved, like one of the organizations that's historically had actually the lowest levels of gender pay disparity is the US Postal Service in the US. And the US Postal Service has just these very clear guidelines. You've worked here this long, you've done this and this, you get paid this. Like it's a formula. At least I think it used to be. I can't actually speak to it right now, but I believe that that's all still mostly in place. And because there was just not no opportunity for subjectivity, but it was still a pretty objective process for determining what people get paid based on very, again, pretty objective criteria. And as soon as we move it into this subjective criteria of like, well, I'm going to evaluate their education and their training and their experience and all these kinds of things and formulate a salary offer through that, like all of a sudden these opportunities for these things to creep in start to show up because an individual manager might hire what, like 5 or 6 people in a year if they're really on a pretty, even that's even a pretty aggressive hiring cycle. And so they don't have the ability to like hold these things up to dozens or hundreds or thousands of comparable examples and go, is this something that makes sense? And so we can train that manager all we want about debiasing their hiring practices and equitable job like all of these kinds of things, but the issue isn't visible at their level. There's always reasons for what they're doing. The issue becomes visible when we start to say, all right, I'm looking at this level 2 programmer with these job responsibilities and I'm comparing it to every other level 2 programmer with these job responsibilities in the company, and that can be hard to see. Like, you typically know the salaries of the people on your team, but you don't know necessarily the salaries. Different organizations have different structures around these things. And what they really found is that they had to have at Salesforce, what they had to have was a very kind of specific and somewhat detailed rubric to make sure that they were comparing apples to apples when they were looking at these kinds of things. And I think they spent something like 3 or 6 million the first year that they did this. When they actually found it, they spent 3 to 6 million, somewhere in there, dollars to address the fact that, yeah, there was some disparities that were just simply not explainable, by anything other than like bias creeps in. And it would have been literally impossible for most managers to have been able to figure this out. You just didn't have the information, they didn't have the data. And so again, we don't see this until we start to get up to the group level, or we get up to, and really they couldn't tell that it was going on until they were looking at it at the system level. And like hand washing, same thing, right? I can't know that my individual behaviors caused this particular problem over here. We might know that we've had infections on the ward and that's bad. So we can recognize that there's an issue at the group level. But honestly, we don't really know there's a problem until we're like at the system level, and our hospital has much higher infection rates than a similar size hospitals, or, comparable organizations. And when there's that disconnect between the behavior is happening at an individual level, but they just can't see it, like salespeople, for example, they know what their sales numbers are. Like they can see their direct results. And it's pretty easy for their managers to kind of do the comps across like the whole team or the organization. And so that's a much easier set of behaviors to see at an individual level and get feedback, effective feedback at an individual level. But some of these things we just can't get a good picture of the problem until we're looking at a whole system. And when you have that disconnect between the individual behavior and the system level feedback, like that's super hard stuff. You have to have system level solutions to address things that are only visible at a system level. Like the post office has a set of systemic guidelines for how they pay people, and that's a systemic solution to a systemic problem, basically.
Yeah, and you mentioned a rubric. So, I mean, a rubric could be developed for the manager who's hiring to consult it and to, see who this person is in front of them that they want to hire and how many years, blah, 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 like consult the rubric. But so the behavior is that they actually have to use the rubric, but the rubric has to be created, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
realize, I guess it's both, isn't it? You have to talk to that enough individual hiring managers to realize that they really don't know how to do the picking of the salaries, right? They don't, as you say, they don't mean to be racist or misogynistic or whatever it is. They literally don't have the information that they need. So the learners give us clues to what might be happening at the other levels.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure there are some bad actors in the system, but I'm sure there's some people who maybe aren't pure of motive. But when we focus on that, we're ignoring the fact that the whole system, kind of propagates an issue. And that's a real challenge for those of us who are, designing learning, because there's a limit to how much leverage we can have over some of these things. So when there's kind of a system level reason that some of this stuff is going on, again, we're asked to do an anti-bias training for managers. And it's kind of like, well, that might help. It might make them aware of some issues that they see. And that might be something where they can, correct some of their individual behaviors. And it might be part of the solution, but it's probably not going to fix the whole problem. So, yeah.
Or changes the nature of the intervention. Like I had a client recently where I love it if I can kind of convince people to hire us for a short-term contract to figure out what the problem is
Yeah.
and do that kind of, focus groups or interviews or, read things or whatever all those pieces are. And one of the things we determined was the ultimate learner group that they were hoping for. They didn't actually have time to attend any workshop, right? Like they did,
Yeah.
like to go to a workshop at a certain time and place and to spend X number of hours, like it was sort of the time, but it was also no one's job to go get the learning, like on the,
Uh-huh.
the learning. And we're like, well, if it's no one's job and no one has time, like, I'm not sure we should make a bounded time course for this, right? Because who's going to come? Like, there's no real learner group there. I mean, we did end up creating something, but it was more of a website than a workshop, right? It's like, okay, so the information has to be somewhere because at some point the learner is going to need it because they're going to realize it becomes someone's job because the problem is happening and someone has to jump in and kind of it becomes
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
responsibility. So we created the website instead of a course. So there was still an intervention, but the nature of the intervention had to change because of what we learned. We're like, who's coming to this 6-week They wanted it to be 6 or 8 weeks long,
Oh my
right? It's like,
goodness.
no, I
Oh,
don't think
wow.
that's not going to happen. Yeah. But you talk about one thing that I was interested in your book that you talk about was the stages of change that learners might be in. And maybe you can explain that a little bit more, because in my healthcare work, like that's in the content of a lot of healthcare related courses for their learners, right? Who are trying to get their learners to make some sort of change in their life. But actually, I've never thought about the stages of change to just learners in general for our work and learning design, not the sort of healthcare content. Tell us a little bit more about the stages of change.
Yeah, and there's a few different versions of this. I have one that I've kind of modified off of some research that was done around what they were talking about was kind of a change ladder, like where are people along, which rung of the ladder are they on and things like that. And it's not always a perfect thing. Like people don't necessarily go through every single stage or things like that. And there's other models like Prochaska and Clemente's, transformational, their change model and, things like that. But this one, it kind of had, I think it was 10 steps where it was like, first of all, is the issue that they just don't know about the behavior. Like, oh, I should do, this thing to protect my data security, right? Like, let's say we're doing cybersecurity and we're trying to get people to use kind of complex passwords, right? So is it that I just don't even know that I shouldn't use the name of my pet with 123, like for every single password I do, right? Is it that they know about the behavior, but they aren't convinced, right? Like they've never gotten any of those data breach notices and, it seems like it's working fine for them so far and they're just not, they don't understand why it's an issue. Is it that they know why it's an issue, but they aren't convinced by the explanation? Because we have that, right? We've been dealing with that obviously around some things like vaccines and so forth, where people understand exactly what the argument is for it, but they're not convinced that it's a good idea for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Is it that they are, convinced, but it's just not a priority for them right now? Like I'm convinced about sunscreen, and it is not always a priority when it should be, even with full knowledge of the potential consequences. Is it that they are convinced, but it seems too intimidating or too difficult? So, like, let's say we're encouraging people to exercise more and they're ready, like, they believe you, they want to exercise, they're on board, but their experiences in the past are that exercise wasn't for them and that they're not athletic and that exercise is painful and unpleasant and all of these kinds of things. So, it seems too difficult to get started, or it seems intimidating or scary, or, any of these kinds of factors around it. Is it that they're even past that and all they really need is just somebody to give them that little nudge to get started and a little bit of, help and hand holding? Is it that they have started but are struggling with consistent behavior? Is it that they have been consistent but now they're kind of falling off the behavior? So at each of these stages, what they need is different. So like, if they don't know about the behavior, education and training is a great solution. Beautiful, perfect. Let's do that. If it's that they know about the behavior but they're not convinced or they're not persuaded or they're not prioritizing it, that's a different start of problems, right? Like it might be about making the case and something that's more focused on persuasion. It might be about helping, but then it might be about like practical assistance. How do you how do you fit this into your day? What's an easy way to get started? How do you just try this out a little bit? Those kinds of things. If they're trying to do it, but like consistency an issue, can you have, an accountability buddy? Can you have some kind of coaching? Can you have some kind of tracking mechanism? If it's about, hey, I've been doing it, but now I'm kind of falling off, is there anything about the environment that we can, help you with to reinforce the behavior? Or is there some kind of refresh or remotivation thing that we can be doing? And so as you move through this, and again, not everybody hits every one of these, and sometimes people have a few of them going on at the same time. The kind of support that you need changes pretty significantly depending on where people are along this continuum. So you give two choices. One is you can try to adapt the intervention so that it meets people where they are. Or the other thing is you can try to have that sort of continuum of resources and help the learners figure out what's going to help them most at a particular point, like some guidance or direction on how do they find the thing that's going to be useful to them.
Yeah. I'm wondering how many times you did design and develop blended learning experiences because, especially I know you design a lot of e-learning. I mean, there's so many times when behavior change needs some other mode, right? Like the coach, the accountability partner, the buddy, the whatever, the job aid, all those additional things to support the learning in these different, to meet these different stages of change. Like, how much do you push back on clients where they're like, nope, I only want e-learning. That's the only thing we're going to do. That's all we've got budget for, blah, blah. And you're like, I know this other thing can, support the solution you're looking for. Like, how much do you stick to your guns, I guess, on it?
Well, I mean, we always have the conversation. I have a really simple table that I use that sort of says, is there stuff that would happen before the learning experience? What's the learning experience itself? How are they going to practice and get feedback? What kind of coaching or mentoring support do they need? How are we going to provide just-in-time materials or performance support materials for it? How do we periodically refresh, and how do they develop further if they want to like take this and go to the next level with it and things like that? I was doing an audit for a manufacturing company around their Six Sigma training, and they really wanted to focus on what's the learning experience, right? Like, how do we fix the classroom? What else do we need? Like, let's audit our classroom materials. And I'm like, actually, your classroom stuff's pretty good. I mean, there's always stuff we can tinker with, sure, but I think it's pretty solid. What I think are your big issues is you have people coming in who don't have enough statistical knowledge, and so there's some pre-learning stuff, some prerequisite requirements that you could really look at there. And also the learning experience was several weeks, and it was so intense that coming back and refreshing it. So a typical Six Sigma project would last 6 months. So come back in at that 6-month mark and maybe add to the curriculum there, which they will now have had the experience of working through a whole project. So they'll have a much better understanding of the process, much more mental models. And so now when you come back and you start to talk a little bit about like that sort of, your more intermediate issues or topics, they will have some way to take that in, which they probably didn't in the first training because it's just too much. And so looking at, that piece, and I think I use the same approach when I'm talking about blended stuff, is like, what series of resources at kind of all of these stages are going to help support this behavior as much as possible. When we're done with the learning event, what's the, instead of just pushing them out the nest and hoping they fly,
Yeah.
what's the soft on ramp? What's the or off ramp, I guess. What's the gently working it back in? A lot of times, we might have a training course on difficult conversations and we might get really great stuff. But if the idea is that they're going to go back out into the world and really tackle some of those hard, difficult conversations, well, that's super intimidating, right? Like, even if you've learned the method and you think, oh, this is really great, it's tough. And so it might be about helping some learners in the class to identify some easy practice opportunities for this. Here's 1 to 3 places where I think I could go use this method that are not that scary. I'm happy to go have that conversation. Let's go and we'll practice this method. And then once I've done it 2 or 3 times in a scenario that's not kind of scary and intimidating, maybe I can kind of work it into some of these harder situations. And so it's really trying to figure out what's the path back to, this becoming a consistent behavior, and where do we need to reinforce it, and what does reinforcement need to look like? A lot of times one of the things I talk about is the fact that we should always be treating, if people's managers are the audience, are going to be pivotal in reinforcing this behavior, then what are we creating for them? Are we creating a separate training for them on how to reinforce this behavior? Are we creating some support materials? Are we giving them a list of tips about how they can reinforce the behavior? It could be any number of solutions, and the answer is it depends, but always kind of viewing that as a secondary audience, because we know that they're pivotal. We know that, managers reinforcing the things that people learned in training is probably one of the biggest determinants of whether that those behaviors actually happen. And so not just creating learning materials for the end learners, but also creating some support materials for their managers is probably a much better strategy for actually promoting the behavior than just focusing on the learning experience.
Yeah, because people could make the mistake that we're reinforcing knowledge only, and we're trying to reinforce behavior change, aren't we? And people are on the job and they have managers or they have colleagues that they can check in with, or yeah, so it's, what's going to support. I love that idea. I'm not sure I've ever been asked or have pushed that to happen, right? Although I know it's a thing and probably have talked about it, but I don't know if it's ever been part of a project.
Yeah, feel free.
Feel
Feel free.
yeah, feel free to yeah, I could probably do a few more things, right? We're
Yeah,
always
yeah.
learning how to do this role better, for sure, all of us, even though we've been doing it for a while. I'm so curious to ask you, and it's slightly different, but it's related. In the age of AI, I want to just ask you, in your perspective as a learning designer, when you see stuff like create a course in 15 minutes, this is a real bee in my bonnet right now. I can't stand seeing this on social media, and it's not just people who design learning ostensibly that are saying this, right? It's companies that have products where we use them to design learning, and they're saying we can create courses in 15 minutes, but courses cannot be created in 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you saying about this kind of stuff because of, especially AI coming along?
Yeah, no, it's been a challenge for me too. And the biggest fundamental issue that I have with a lot of this stuff is there's a few different models of how we could potentially use the AI. And I have this whole like transport analogy. There's the acceleration model, right? Which is, can I accelerate your performance? So I've got somebody who is already an experienced learning designer, and can they, use AI to create a bunch of stuff, and then they can pick through and say, oh, well, 60 or 70% of this is pretty useful. We'll use that, and we'll kind of modify the other, 20 to 30% or whatever the number may be. And, initially, like some of these here, you can just create a learning experience with AI stuff was pretty bad. Oof. It's gotten better. It has unquestionably gotten better. And I honestly was a bit, laggardly. I was a bit of a laggard about the AI adoption because I was not super impressed for a long time with the outputs. They were full of hallucinations or just very surface, or whatever it is. And I think that that's improving, but the majority of use of specifically the large language model AIs, because there's different kinds of AI, and I'm not qualified to talk about any of them probably, but I'm certainly not qualified to talk about the ones that are not the large language model, which is the most common stuff, right? Your chat GPTs and your Claudes and your Geminis and things like that. The primary model where we're seeing utility in them now is somebody who knows how to do the job, is accelerating their output, but they're capable of evaluating the output and making judgments about it. Are they? That's a different problem. That's more that psychological stamina piece of actually checking this before you copy and paste it. And we know people aren't always checking it. There have been lawyers who've been, I don't know if they've actually been sanctioned, but boy, they got yelled at a lot for, legal cases that didn't exist because they didn't check the outputs. There was that thing with I think it was the Chicago Tribune published it was a franchise piece, so it wasn't actually a Chicago Tribune writer who did an article of summer reads, and none of the
I
books
read that.
existed. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an element to that when we look at it from a behavior change point of view, like, oh, okay, it's giving you all this great stuff. However, you have to have this psychological stamina to proofread the outputs and either verify that they're accurate or evaluate them using your own judgment to say, yes, they're worthwhile. This is a good learning experience, or this is the right content, or just any of those kinds of things. And we know that relying over much on people's ability to proofread things has not historically been a great strategy. There's a reason why copy editors are, that's a professional role, because most people are not great at this sort of careful proofreading. I mean, some people are absolutely being responsible and doing that 100%, but has there been a little bit of careless copying and pasting? Oh, I suspect just a bit. And so that fundamentally only works if A, the person has the ability to judge the outputs, and B, that they are actually exerting the effort to do so.
Yeah, and asking the right questions, right? Like, we're the ones that have to put in the right prompts to get it to, help us do the things that you're advocating us do around designing for behavior change. Like, we can't just say, design a course for behavior change to ChatGPT, can we? Like, there's just hundreds and hundreds of things we have to do
Yeah,
in the early
you can, and
stages.
it will give you a thing, but will it be any good?
Will it be any good? Will it
Yeah.
solve the right problem, right? The true problem?
And I mean, one of the uses that we're undoubtedly looking at is a different than the acceleration model, where somebody knows how to do the job and they're just doing it faster and improve and increasing their productivity using these tools. We're also looking at the elevation model, right? Which is, here you're a novice, but I'm going to give you ChatGPT, a ChatGPT agent app that you can ask questions of, and it's going to accelerate or elevate your performance. So you would be a novice, but I can get you to be an intermediate customer service agent by giving you, an AI tool that will answer questions for you. And that's a much more complicated and problematic use of it, because the person is not capable of evaluating the outputs. ChatGPT doesn't just give you errors, it gives you errors very confidently, and it makes it sound really good. It also tells you what you want to hear. Like the amount of flattery that's been going on in these AI agents is fascinating to me. I'm just super curious about that. And so now we have a situation where I'm asking you to operate at this level, even though your knowledge is down here, and you're not capable of identifying where there's issues there. And that one means that we have to have a lot more security in these systems than I think we currently do. And I've asked people who know more about this than I do, like, what is going to be that checks and balances on the computer system side? And there's technology that they're working on and ways that they're trying to do validation for it. But depends on if you think the propensity to hallucinate is a feature or a bug. And I think it's a feature, and if it is, then I don't know if it's ever going away completely. And then organizationally, we have the issue down the road, which is if I'm not growing new people with expert knowledge of these things, where is that going to come from? If I'm not having people come along this curve where they can, again, become experts and evaluate the outputs and, be the judge of this. Right now, people learn to do that because they start out as beginners and they work their way up and then they know a lot. And where is that coming from? Especially as things change, like the translation algorithms need to constantly ingest the work of human translators in order to keep up with the changes in language. So there's all this terminology that gets used, in 2025 that nobody was saying in 2015 when some of these language algorithms were actually trained. And this is going to be true of all of these things. And so you need to have like some way to continue to take stuff in order to update it. And where is that coming from if we're not? And I mean, this is a huge issue, obviously, in things like education and higher ed. Are people learning the thing or are they just learning how to press the button?
I don't know. Yeah, it's going to take us in a direction we don't have time to keep talking about, do we? But
know, right?
Fascinating, and just watch this space, but be critical of everything, right? Like pay attention.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's a lot
Yeah.
to pay attention to when using that too. Julie, thank you so much. I'll give you the last word. Is there anything that you haven't said that you really want to make sure is said about your book, Designing for Behavior Change?
Yeah, if people do read it, please go and review it because there are algorithms that it needs a few more reviews before it's going to start to get kind of recommended by the systems a little bit more. So if you do read it and you enjoyed it, please go review it. I am teaching a workshop in October through the Learning Development Accelerator on basically the content of the Elephant book. So if people want to do an actual workshop on the learning how to design for behavior change, that's great. I think one thing I didn't really mention about that is that a lot of that behavior change material is coming from this domain of behavioral science. And there's been just a huge amount of kind of advancement coming up in behavioral science. And I think so much of it's useful to us as learning and development people. So, the Elephant book is the attempt to take a lot of this insight from behavioral science and bring it over to learning and development in a way that makes sense and is in context for the challenges that we all have. Otherwise, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. We could have talked all day for sure. It's been a pleasure to read both of your books, and I'll make sure I get everything in the show notes so people can follow up with you as well afterwards, and keep reading, keep learning, and keep connecting with you wherever you are. So thanks for taking the time to write books for the field. Right? Not everybody does. It's a labor of love. It's a lot of work. So appreciate that you've not just written one, but now two for the rest of us. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, and every time anybody tells me that it's really useful, even that's what it's for. So it makes me really, really happy when that happens. So I'm so grateful that so many people have found them useful.
I had been really looking forward to this conversation with Julie, and she did not disappoint. I did love the fact that she told so many stories and gave so many examples in the conversation, as I mentioned earlier. And I learned a couple things too, or at least had them enhanced for myself, that I need to pay a little bit more attention to them in my own work. I thought, as I mentioned, the stages of change piece is interesting to really think about not only demographic information or other types of knowledge-based information about our learners, but maybe where they are in terms of their motivation levels to participate in the learning experience around something like the stages of change or other similar models. So that was interesting to help me think a little bit more deeply about the learner experience, because if we're designing for behavior change, motivation is a huge part of it. And I loved that she gave that list of the gaps that learners can have. It can be a knowledge gap, it can be a skill gap, it can be motivation, it can be around habit changing or environmental. And the identification of that gap is really important for us to then design an appropriate solution for. I also liked the pre and post learning experience pieces that we got talking about toward the end, and how if we're designing for behavior change on the part of the employees or whoever it is in the work experience, say, then we need to get their managers involved and perhaps design something for the manager so that they can reinforce the behavior change that the person is hopefully doing on the job or wherever they're demonstrating those behaviors. So lots of conversation there that took us in so many good directions. I could have just kept talking with her for hours, as I feel like with so many of my guests. I hope that it was an accessible conversation for you, even if you do not do learning design as your main part of your role. And if you are more on the facilitation side, I hope it expanded your knowledge around these foundational pieces that you can continue to learn about. So get Julie's book, listen to it, read it, do both like I'm doing. And I hope it helps expand your design knowledge for the betterment of yourself and your learners in the future. Thanks again to Julie Dirksen for being on the show. The next episode of the podcast is a solo one with me. I'm going to be delving into the topic of silence in our facilitation. So using silence, not using silence, transgressions around silence, considerations. I won't say any more than that, but catch me next time on the show to think about silence in our design and in our facilitation of our learning. I'll see you then. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you're looking for the transcript or the show notes for the episode, you can find those on my website on facilitatingonpurpose.ca. I would love to have your feedback about any episode, including how I can make it more accessible for you, or if you'd like to share a tip with me, please reach out to me via the website or on any social media channel, and I would love to hear from you. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing you can do is to rate the show, subscribe to it, and share it with a friend who you think might be able to use it. I would appreciate that very much. Thanks, and see you next time.